few words of background about the G20, and then I'll share some perspectives, especially on the issues of transparency and food security. In terms of background, I think that when the United States triggered the global financial crisis, it was like a heart attack, like a heart attack in the world, and especially for countries like Mexico that are so connected to the US economy. And I think that the shock was so profound that the pinnacle of capitalism in the United States could be so irresponsible, so negligent, that there could be such a profound failure at the heart of the global economy. And when the US triggered the crisis, in the international institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, country representatives were stumbling around in a fog because they had been following the model of Anglo-American capitalism, and the model had exploded. And so it's very natural, for us as observers of this great historical drama to wonder when the G20 was actually created in 1998. So it's an old institution, but it only began meeting at the summit level, at the level of presidents and prime ministers, right during the crisis. And so I think many of us wondered, well, we certainly don't want the G7 or the G8, the Western countries, many of whose models are failing to lead. Will it be an improvement to be more inclusive? And then we wondered, in 2008, when the G20 met at the president's level and they said, we are the premier forum, the #1 forum for international economic cooperation. And many of us wondered, well, what does this mean? Is it better that G8, G7 are not planning in secret anymore what the future of global institutions and global citizenry will be? Will we hear new voices? Will we hear different messages than we've been hearing in the past about the neoliberal model? So many of us were asking that question with great urgency because, as my panelists have described so eloquently, we have these multiple crises that engulf us, and we desperately need answers. And what have we learned in these 2 years? Well, I think what is very well known is that the financial crisis continues, that financial regulation has failed to date. And the head of the International Monetary Fund, I'm sure none of you have ever heard of Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the former head of the IMF. I couldn't believe it. One day I was reading his press release and it said, we must stop privatizing gains and socializing losses. And in fact, the Occupy movement has been a reaction to a massive privatization of gain and socialization of losses. And the G20 so far seems to be accelerating these trends, not stopping them. And so we're full of concern. And when the foundation began its G20 program, it was after the summit in South Korea. And I didn't put this on the table, but if anyone wants a copy of the development agenda that was launched in South Korea, please pick up a copy. I think I was in Korea when this was launched, and it was a very shocking experience for me personally, because the main countries that are impacted by the Development Action Plan are the low-income countries, and there were no low-income countries in Korea that were creating this action plan. Now, the G8 has been telling the world its development model, and I thought, well, is the G20, even after so many emerging market countries have suffered terribly under the International Monetary Fund rules that are trade off austerity for growth, I thought, are the G20 doing the same thing to the G173, the excluded countries? And so the foundation asked me to really look into this development action plan. So I'm going to say a few words about that, about the development action plan. The heart of the development action plan promotes public-private partnerships, or the privatization of agriculture and infrastructure in the context of trade liberalization. This is the heart of the plan. And last year the summit was in Cannes, and I spoke to the French Sherpa, the lead negotiator, and I said, well, this plan, it's very brown. It's not green. It promotes huge infrastructure and privatization, which sometimes has very significant impacts on vulnerable groups, women, and so on. And I said, where is the green element? And she said, oh, the green element, it's too difficult to discuss at the G20. And my heart sank. And so while the G20 is known for its failures in the financial arena, it's not well known that in Korea this big development plan was launched and is now being rolled out around the world, is being implemented around the world. Now, many of you may ask, why should we care about a summit? It happens once a year, this year, June 18th to 20th in Los Cabos. 2 days, so what? What's the big deal? But what some people don't fully recognize is the G20 has created an entire institutional infrastructure that works all year round. I could only begin, if I had a beautiful PowerPoint like Alejandro's, it would show all the groups, the finance ministers meeting, the Sherpas meetings, the labor ministers, the agriculture ministers. Mexico is going to convene 2 vice ministry agriculture ministers this year, the development working group, an anti-corruption working group, an energy working group. This is just the beginning. It has a gigantic structure that works all year round. And then the leaders just come together to sign off on the plans that all of their ministries have developed over the course of the year. Well, this week has been really interesting for me because not only have I had an opportunity to meet with an international civil society group, but also, along with Thomas, a think tank 20 group. And so we were having dinner in the Folk Art Museum last night, and we were being addressed by the finance minister, as well as one of the heads of the B20. How many people know what the B20 is? Raise your hand. The Business 20 is comprised of over 100 CEOs, chief executive officers of corporations. And the Mexican head of the B20 described his agenda, and I'm going to describe it to you. The B20, the Business 20, has 8 working groups: green growth, food security, trade and investment, employment, anti-corruption, communications technology, and financing growth, including trade finance and financial inclusion, and advocacy and implementation of their agenda. So there are 8 working groups. Now, one of the problems that has given rise to terrible inequality and crisis is what they call in English, somebody has to tell me how to say it in Spanish when we're done, because I need to learn. In English, it's regulatory capture. It means that the business tells government what to do. So part of our role as the Heinrich Böll Foundation in these different fora is to say, okay, business is telling government what to do, and it's important that civil society, that democracy function in a way so that government can be responsive not just to transnational industries and businesses, but to citizens. And I want to shift gears and tell you a few things that are at the top of our agenda as a foundation that we really care about changing at the G20. Number 1 is transparency. As Ingrid mentioned, almost no one seems to be aware that at the French summit, all the presidents and prime ministers said that the Mexican summit should review a food and water action plan from all the multilateral development banks and move this food and water action plan. But nobody's seen the food and water action plan. This is a very bad sign. Last year, the leaders in Seoul told all of the multilateral development banks to bring an infrastructure action plan to the French summit. And that is the infrastructure action plan is a recipe for disaster because it has no environmental or almost no environmental dimension and very little social or gender dimension. So we're concerned about transparency. If you want to visit my website, I leak a lot of documents onto my website. I am Ms. WikiLeaks. You know WikiLeaks?
Nancy Leaks.
Nancy Leaks. So the second thing we're concerned about is that the G20 is giving mandates to 26 international organizations. These 26 international organizations have their own executive boards, and why should the G20 give mandates and tell these institutions what to do? Give them advice? Sure. But why should 20 countries tell 193 countries what to do? So we don't like the mandates. This development action plan launched in Seoul is a whole list of all the mandates given. Number 3, Alejandro mentioned the importance of having space for citizen action and bottom-up development. And we don't want the G20 to have veto power over national policies. In the food security arena, the G20 has had debates on 3 issues that we feel very strongly about: biofuels, food reserves, and commodity speculation. And when the UN Committee on Food Security met in Rome recently, they were discussing these 3 topics, and all of the governments said, oh, we can't talk about these things because the G20 is speaking on these topics, and they are above our pay level. So if our ministers and our presidents and our prime ministers are saying, no limits to biofuels, no limits to subsidies to biofuels, no limits to commodity speculation, no food buffers and reserves, or only tiny, tiny pilot reserve programs for gross hunger emergencies, then the UN was saying, if the G20 is making decisions about these things, we can't talk. This is why the foundation cares so deeply about democratizing global governance. It's a big, I don't know how it sounds in Spanish, democratization of global governance. It just means that there's diversity of viewpoints in the international sphere. So I will just end by telling you one of my contributions to the Think Tank 20, because I was on 3 or 4 panels, but I just want to tell you one contribution because I have 1 minute. The G20 really cares passionately about agricultural productivity for many good reasons. There are a lot of people on the planet, and there's a great deal of hunger, and we all want to increase productivity. But my contribution was that productivity is not just a technical and economic question. It's also a question of equality, especially gender equality. Let me tell you why. And I know there are some experts here that know this better than I do. Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, who's now head of UN Women, she has headed a commission for the G20. Why is she working for the G20? That's another topic. But she said the other day that if women had equal access to agriculture inputs, meaning credit, land, water, seeds, then agricultural productivity would rise by 20 or 30%. Okay? I wanted the Think Tank 20 to really notice that economics does not exist in a vacuum, that we are all connected, and that social justice and democracy and so-called green, meaning low, no carbon economy, these are all connected, and we can't get where we're going, we can't save the planet unless we work on them all together. Thank you.